My name is Louis Loriseb, and I am the conductor for this production of Carmen here at the IU Opera Theater. Bizet wrote Carmen in 1874, premiered in 1875. So we're at that time in romantic music, right, where the romantic era is in full bloom and all of the chromatic colors are swirling around in these compositions, but still obviously very tonal music. And, we have differences between Tchaikovsky and Bruckner and Bizet and all of these composers all working within that sort of lush canvas. Bizet wrote it for the Opéra Comique. So that meant that it wasn't for the Grand Opéra de Paris. So we have a different set of rules. The biggest difference was that there were no recitatives. So the dialogue was actually spoken. So in fact, Carmen was more like a musical that we would know from the grand era of musicals in the early parts of the 1900s. This became a problem after Bizet died and Carmen became such a popular opera. It really took the world by storm almost immediately after he died. It's sort of sad because he never got to realize how popular it had become. But that being said, if we were to do it at that time at the Grand Opera, you couldn't have dialogue. And so what happened was a great composer named Ernest Guiraud wrote sung recitatives. And so then we have something which made more of what would be expected at the Grand Opera. If we were to talk to some people in the general public and ask who was a composer who was a prodigy but died young, I'm suspecting most people would say Mozart. I think Mozart is the quote-unquote poster child for that sort of thing. Maybe we would get some answers of Mendelssohn or Schubert, and the list goes on. I don't think many people think of Bizet that way, but Bizet really was an incredibly gifted composer from his youth, and in his teens won the Prix de Rome, which was a very important prize, and unfortunately died at age 36. I think it's about 9 months longer of a life than Mozart's. So we have sort of those same things happening in terms of what could have been had he lived longer. However, his music is so rich in expression and it's so specific. When you listen to a work by Bizet, you are taken by these wonderful, wonderful feelings of whatever he's trying to have you listen to. When he was younger, he wrote something called Roma, which is, for all intents and purposes, a symphony. And each one of them, even though it's called Roma, depicts a city in Italy. And so evocative, but again, still within the late French Romantic guise that he was, seeped in as a child. So Carmen is full of drama. Carmen is full of pathos. Carmen is full of the ability to depict what we still feel today, which is why we still love it, I believe, so much now today in 2025. As many composers did during the time of Bizet, he was working with what the Italians called the tinta. So, they didn't have the movies back then, and what you would do was you went to the theater to be transported somewhere. And that had, there were no serious repercussions or compunctions about doing that at the time. And so we get a lot of operas that we still love today because the music endures that depict different places. I forget who says it, and I don't even know if people really know, but it was either a Spanish person or a French person who said, if you want to listen to the best Spanish music, go listen to a French composer, which is, a little problematic, shall we say, but it is true. If you look at Ravel, Debussy, Bizet with Carmen, they were so taken by the Spanish elements and wrote some incredible music. What makes Carmen, though, at its core still French, I believe, is the long melodic line. So French music has this long breadth of expression, whereas, let's say, Italian opera, written at the same time, may have long lines, but they are punctuated with these taking this out or that out, or wanting the listener to have these little bursts of expression. And it goes with the way they speak, in fact. So this beautiful, long, elegant line, if I'm thinking of the Micaela José duet, where you have that beautiful long melody. Other elements are the setting of the text, which in French music, more than in Italian or German or even English, doesn't really care if you put the syllable on the right beat, which is also part and parcel of this long expression of line. As long as the last note has the right syllable, then you've got that set. Other elements of Carmen, which are part of this grand tradition of French writing, is an extreme sensibility to orchestration. So Bizet uses the orchestra with a lot of care and uses different elements to create these worlds. I mean, not only in the opera, but of course we have the three famous entr'actes, right? So the first one depicting José military style with the bassoon solo, then the one between the second and the third act, the beautiful E flat with the flute solo showing Micaela coming through the mountains with her courage, and then of course the Tinta of Spain in full force in the final entr'acte. But throughout, it's that style, that idiom, which combines all of these elements together to make a cohesive piece of music. One of the big issues that we have in trying to recreate such a famous piece like Carmen is that there weren't any compunctions at the time about taking different people's experiences, different cultures that Bizet or other people had never experienced themselves, and infusing them into a work of art. That wasn't something that was to be a concern, but it was in fact lauded. People wanted to have that happen. Today, thankfully, we are far more concerned about the implications that may have to various people. And the idea of appropriation is a real big concern. I think that each piece has its own set of complications, and I think each piece needs to be dealt with specifically. What makes Carmen, I think, still so important and still able to be performed is that at its core, it's about the relationships between human beings. And those relationships are still relevant and important. And so because the music allows us to really explore these and to hopefully find better versions of ourselves with the use of resources, with listening to other people, we hopefully can create a performance that helps illuminate rather than discriminate. The other thing about Carmen, which is so interesting, is that the lens of society also has shifted completely as to who is to blame. So one of the reasons the premiere of Carmen was not a great success was that many people couldn't believe that a woman of quote unquote vice would be put on the stage and to be lauded in such a way, someone who was so quote unquote immoral. And it was José who was the victim of Carmen. Now, thankfully, we don't see it that way. And it's his abusive nature, his violence, his murderous being that is brought to the forefront. And, Katura, our director, is so wonderful, and she's creating such a dynamic production that really, again, helps frame Carmen for our 21st century audiences. Carmen is one of those operas. It's in the top 10 of the most performed operas still today. And it's one of those operas where individual pieces from the opera have transcended classical music and are part of popular culture. Two that come to mind are the Havanaise, the Habanera, that Carmen sings in the first act. And another example is the Toreador song that Escamillo sings in the second act. So the opera begins with a lot of sort of preamble before we get to meet Carmen. And Carmen has been working in the cigarette factory with the other women who were working there. And they come out for their break, and everyone is so entranced and waiting to see Carmen. And in that context of knowing that everyone in her vicinity is listening to her, watching her, she sings the Habanera. And its refrain is sort of her credo in a way. And it says, if you love me, I will not love you. And if you do not love me, I will love you. But if I love you, beware. And so that really is a great sort of encapsulation of the core of how she feels about love and about these relationships, hardened by her life experiences, of course. And from that point on, in that, it's our introduction to the character. And from that point on, we get to go forward. We get to meet the great bullfighter Escamillo in the second act. And he comes to Las Pastias, where they're all having a great time. And he comes in with bravado and flair and elegance. I think a lot of times we have now depicted Escamillo as sort of this gruff, rough, sort of bull in his own way. But in fact, he's a very elegant man. And so when he introduces everyone, again, just like Carmen, he sings about himself and his experiences and knows that everyone is watching him. The two of them are very interesting because they are both, though having completely different backgrounds, different life experiences, they both know what it's like to have the eyes of everyone who's around, to have that energy just pervade the room. And both of these arias showcase that. It is an honor to be an alum of the school, for sure. And it is an honor to have been able to come back and to have conducted, now this is my third opera professionally. But Carmen is a little more special. So my very first year here, we did Carmen. Maestro Efron was the conductor. And I was a TA as a pianist. And so I played the score for rehearsals and got to know it very intimately, of course. And it just so happened that one day the room run was in 301, we had a room run where we were going to do the whole opera. And Maestro Efron was rehearsing the orchestra, and the assistant had to rehearse the banda. And very graciously, Maestro Efron allowed me to conduct the room run. So that was a very special moment. And one of my first experiences ever being in an opera pit was when Maestro Efron, at the beginning of one of the rehearsals, allowed me to conduct the beginning of Carmen into the first scene. And I've remembered that. And when I now am the conductor, I always try to have my assistants conduct. And I'm quite proud of the fact that, I've been able to do that. And I remember that because it was such a pivotal moment for me to get to be there. And I still have the video of it somewhere with Maestro Efron behind me, encouraging me. So to be able to come back and to do it, and I believe this is the first time since then that it has been done here at IU. So it's very special for me. The chorus, the principals are fantastic and they're working so hard and they're doing a great job, but all of the elements musically here are at such a high level that it is truly a joy. The chorus, the opera chorus is one of the great choruses, and the Philharmonic is one of the great orchestras here in the US. And so to be able to do this piece with these groups of people, truly astounding and so exciting. Talking about the various different versions of Carmen. There's so many different versions because, he died about, a few weeks after its premiere. Although, I grew up a long time thinking that, he never was able to revise it. But that is not true. Bizet did revise it. So if you look at the manuscript is a very difficult document because it has his revisions, it has his, obviously, the original, and it has, Guiraud, it has so many different people who tampered with it, right? And so then you can't find a version of Carmen to do because there are so many different ones. And then even if you look at the manuscript and you say, well, Bizet took that out, well, why did he take it out? So for example, when Escamillo leaves in the third act, he says his very elegant farewell, and the Toreador song is played. It was originally scored for 4 cellos. And in the manuscript as we have it, Bizet reorchestrated it for the full orchestra. Now, why did he do that? Did he think that the 4 cellos were a bad idea? Or rather, did he listen to it and realize that, various orchestras have, are blessed with different levels of cello playing, shall we say. And so when I was a student here, I showed this to Maestro Efron, and he actually did the 4 cellos. If you have the Philharmonic, you should do it, right? And so of course, I'm doing it as well. So that's a very special moment where those four cellos get to play, and a special moment of virtuosity for the players in the orchestra. It truly is sad to think of how he died not realizing how popular it would become. When he was writing it, he was very happy with it, and he said it's full of color. I'm really, the quote escapes me now, but in general, I mean, the gist of it was he was very happy with what he had created. The premiere wasn't like a fiasco. It wasn't The Rite of Spring, right? But it wasn't good, and people didn't love some of the music. Gounod, for example, we don't have the quote exactly, right? But Gounod was his teacher. And Gounod said, he stole this from me and he stole that from me and all of this stuff. And he was upset, so they say at the premiere, right? Then I think it's 6 weeks afterwards, Bizet dies, and Gounod gives the eulogy and breaks down in tears because he's so upset, right? And I think that's a really telling example of how everyone felt about Bizet and the music. The same critics who said, this is immoral, this is not great music, it's not worth our time, all this stuff. He dies. They have, I think, days afterwards, a performance, and it is the greatest piece in the world. And it sort of catapults Carmen. So I don't believe he realized that it would be a success. And I think he even said something, it looks like this is going to amount to a failure. But I hope deep down somewhere that original feeling of pride and excitement for what he created was somewhere in him, and that somehow, somewhere he can realize, just how special it was and is. We've been talking a lot about all the different elements, all of the Spanish elements and all these things that are infused into the score. But there's also the Romani element. So, of course, Carmen is a Romani, and they have a musical heritage which is very rich, some of which was known to Bizet. So at the beginning of the opera, we have the Seville, we have all of that. Then we have Escamillo. These are the elements of the prelude. And then the famous, what people call the Fate theme, Carmen's theme, dee-da-da-da-dum, right? Now that melody is built off of a Romani scale. So ba-da-da-dee-da-da-dee-dum, dee-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. So even those first four bars, that's a pure Romani scale. And then he does a sequential repetition, da 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 dee da da dum, which is pure Western European classical French melody, right? Why I bring it up is that even in that we see the genius of Bizet, is that we start with the Romani music, and as it continues on, it melds into, shall we say, Spanish or European music, José. Carmen, José melded together. And so, I mean, that's just a little taste of the brilliance that is everywhere. So anyway, I find that really fascinating and fun to think about.